The auctioneer's voice was flat that October afternoon, the way voices get after hours of reading the same lines to the same indifferent room. Lot 14. Harroway Point Light Station. Crestfall County, Oregon. Decommissioned 1993. Structure and half-acre parcel. Sold as is. No guarantee of habitability. No warranty of title for personal property within. Minimum bid, $1. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Nobody moved. I was sitting in the third row of folding chairs in the Crestfall County Administration Building, wearing my father's old canvas jacket because the morning had turned cold without warning and I hadn't thought to bring my own. The jacket smelled of machine oil and salt air. It had been hanging on a hook in my kitchen for 3 years, since the day I drove up to Aldwick to collect what was left of his things after he died. I kept wearing it out of habit. The feeling that something of his still existed in a physical form, not just in the logbooks stacked in a box in my back seat, not just in the photographs, not just in the stubborn set of my own jaw when I'm thinking hard about something. The auctioneer waited 30 seconds. He looked at the room. The room looked back at the floor. I raised my hand. $7, I said. Because the minimum was $1 and I had money enough for $7, and I was not going to be the person who paid a single dollar for something her father spent 24 years of his life keeping. $7, the auctioneer repeated. Going once. I heard my sister Pamela make a sound somewhere behind me. Not words. A sound that communicated an entire opinion without the effort of forming it into a sentence. Going twice. The gavel came down. Sold. The county clerk handed me a receipt and a key on a ring tagged with a strip of masking tape. The handwriting on the tape said Harroway PT. The key was heavy, old pattern, the kind cut for a lock that hadn't been manufactured in 40 years. I put it in my jacket pocket and walked out into the October wind. My father, Edmund Weld, had been the keeper of Harroway Point Light for 24 years, from 1967 to 1991, when the Coast Guard completed the last phase of full automation along the Oregon coast and retired the remaining keeper positions. He had taken the job at 31 because he wanted to live near the ocean, and the work suited a man who thought too much for crowded places. He raised my brother Kevin and my sister Pamela and me in the keeper's cottage beside the lighthouse, the three of us growing up to the sound of the fog horn and the particular loneliness of a point of land with water on 3 sides. We walked the beach before school. We did our homework by lamplight when storms took the power. We learned the names of passing ships by their silhouettes on the horizon. I was the one most like him in temperament. That is not something I say to wound Kevin or Pamela. It was simply the plain truth that my father and I shared a way of being in the world. Both quiet workers. Both careful. We thought about things longer than people expected and sometimes forgot to announce our conclusions even after we'd reached them. He died at 79 of a second stroke, and I was the one who made the 4-hour drive to Aldwick to collect his belongings. Kevin didn't want the logbooks. Pamela said they were old notebooks and asked me to recycle them if I wasn't going to keep them. I kept them. The county clerk's name was Roy Finn, and he had processed Crestfall County property sales for 19 years. He looked at my receipt, looked at me, and let out a slow breath through his nose. That lighthouse has been sitting empty for 30 years, he said. The roof of the cottage has failed in 2 places. The fog signal building has collapsed entirely. There may be asbestos in the original fixtures. We don't know. We didn't test. I understand, I said. You'll need liability insurance on it before you can access it. He looked at me the way people look when they're trying to decide whether to say something more. He decided against it and handed me the ownership transfer documents. Pamela caught me in the parking lot. She had come to the auction because Kevin had asked her to, both of them operating on the shared assumption that no one would bid on a condemned lighthouse, which meant the county would retain it and nobody would have to explain why no one in the family had thought to do anything about it. When I raised my hand, she had looked genuinely startled. Nora, she said in the parking lot, pulling her coat tighter. What are you planning to do with a lighthouse? I don't know yet, I said. It's falling apart. Roy Finn said the roof has failed. You spent $7 on a ruin. It isn't condemned. They would have noted that in the listing. She looked at the key in my hand. You could have just driven out and looked at it. You didn't have to buy it. I know that. A pause. Kevin thinks you're grieving and making bad decisions. I put the key in my jacket pocket. Kevin can think whatever he wants. I drove out to the point that afternoon. The road was 2 miles of broken pavement through coastal scrub, the kind of road that suggests the county stopped maintaining it some years ago and has been hoping nobody would notice. The lighthouse appeared half a mile out. White tower against a gray sky, the lantern room at the top dark, the keeper's cottage beside it with most of its windows intact, which I hadn't expected. The fog signal building was gone. Only a concrete pad remained, with rusted anchor bolts sticking up from it like old teeth. I parked and sat with the engine off. The wind off the ocean moved. The grass in long waves. Somewhere on the rocks below the point, sea lions were arguing in their particular way, the sound of ongoing disagreement without resolution. The lighthouse stood exactly as I remembered it from childhood, except smaller. Things always are, when you return to them. I got out and walked to the base of the tower. The steel door had been painted over so many times its color had become indefinite. The key fit. The lock turned with a grinding reluctance, the kind that suggests it hasn't been asked to do this in a long time. And then it released, and the door swung open. Inside, the tower smelled of concrete and rust, and the specific damp of ocean air sealed into a space for decades. A spiral staircase wound upward, the iron steps pitted with corrosion, but solid underfoot. The walls were bare concrete, interrupted at intervals by small windows that let in some light, but no warmth. I climbed. The lantern room at the top was intact. The glass prisms of the old Fresnel lens were still in place, dusty but unbroken. The brass fittings had gone greenish with neglect. The floor held a fine layer of grit and what looked like the remains of several small birds that had found their way in and not found their way out again. I stood at the curved windows and looked out at the water. The same view I had seen from this spot as a child, standing beside my father while he checked the light before dark. He had stood here for 24 years. In all weather. At all hours. I pressed my hand against the cold glass and looked west until the horizon blurred. The keeper's cottage was in better shape than I expected. The floors were sound. The kitchen and the 2 bedrooms were filthy but structurally intact. Someone had cleaned it out after decommissioning. The furniture was long gone, the fixtures stripped. What remained was the bones of a place where a family had lived. I walked through it room by room. In what had been my bedroom, a pencil line was still faintly visible on the door frame. Someone had marked heights there over a period of years, the mark stopping at what would have been my height at about 12. In the kitchen, a paper tag was still taped inside one of the cabinet doors. The writing was my father's. It said, "Lids in drawer below." I stood in that kitchen for a long time. The pressure of the situation was not abstract. I had been laid off from Crestfall Regional Insurance 7 months earlier when the company was absorbed and my department eliminated. I had enough savings to last 4 or 5 more months at the rate I was going. The apartment I rented in Aldwick was in a building whose owner had raised rents 3 years running and would raise them again in January. My car needed tires, and I had spent $7 on a lighthouse with no water, no electricity, and a roof that had failed. Kevin called me that evening. "Pamela told me you actually bid," he said. "I did. Nora." He used the tone he reserved for explaining things to people he considered impractical. "That property has no utilities. No water connection, no electrical service. It would cost $50,000 to make it livable at minimum. Probably more if there's asbestos. I'm not planning to live there." "Then what is the plan?" The honest answer was that I had seen the auction listing in the county notices 6 weeks earlier, and something in me had simply decided, without a committee vote, that I was going to be there when it came up. That I was not going to sit somewhere while Harroway Point Light was sold for $1 to a person who didn't know what it was. "I'll figure it out," I said. Kevin was quiet for a moment. "Dad's been gone 3 years. You can't keep doing things for him." I looked at the 26 logbooks on my kitchen table. Their dates ran from 1967 to 1991. "I'm not doing it for him," I said. That was the night I started reading them. I had glanced through them briefly when I packed them up 3 years earlier, enough to understand what they were. My father had kept them methodically, the way the position required. Daily entries, weather observations, shipping traffic, equipment checks, maintenance records. The handwriting was small and precise for most of the years, growing slightly looser in the later volumes as his hands changed. Most of the entries were utilitarian. Wind from the northwest at 18 knots. Fog from 0300 to 0930. Lens polished. Clockwork mechanism oiled. But there were other entries scattered through the years, entries not about weather or equipment. Small observations. Notes to himself. In March of 1973, N. found a harbor seal pup on the rocks below. We moved it above the tide line. It was gone by morning. In 1980, the Callaway passed at 0430 heading north. I've watched that ship go by for 11 years and still don't know what it carries. In 1985, N. starts high school next week. Seems ready. More ready than she knows. I read that one 3 times. The logbooks for 1989 to 1991 were more clipped. Shorter entries. The drawn-out process of automation had created a kind of professional limbo for the remaining keepers, and my father knew for 2 years before it ended that it was ending. The last entry in the last logbook was dated September 30th, 1991. Lens secured. Clockwork disengaged. Final keeper's log entry for Harroway Point Light Station. 24 years, 3 months, 14 days of continuous service. The light is in good order. That was all. I closed the last logbook and sat at my kitchen table. Then I opened it again and looked at the inside back cover. An envelope was taped there. Small, letter-sized. My name on the front in my father's handwriting. I don't know how I had missed it. I must have stopped at the last written entry 3 years ago and never thought to check the covers. The envelope was the same color as the aged cardboard. Easy to miss if you weren't looking. I opened it carefully. The flap had been sealed, then reinforced with tape, the kind of precaution a person takes when they want something to stay closed until the right time. The letter inside was 2 pages, handwritten, dated 6 months before his stroke. He had written it in full health, in the firm, clear hand of the early logbooks. It began, "Nora, if you're reading this, you kept the logbooks. I thought you would. I always thought you would." I read the letter straight through. Then I set it down. Then I picked it up and read it again, more slowly. My father wrote the way he had always spoken, without decoration. One thing, then the next, the same way he had made his daily entries for 24 years. He wrote that he had something to tell me that he had been meaning to say for a long time and kept not saying because he was waiting for the right moment, and the right moment never came, and then the strokes came. He was sorry for the delay. He wanted me to know that what he was going to tell me was real and documented and legal, and that he had gone to some lengths to make sure of that, and that I should not let anyone tell me otherwise. Then he told me about the parcel. In 1969, 2 years after he had taken the position at Harroway Point, a regional Coast Guard administrator named Harrison M. Falk had come to the station for a scheduled inspection. Falk was in the process of reducing the formal federal Lighthouse reservation boundary, consolidating government land to the immediate half-acre around the tower and cottage. The surrounding 38 acres of coastal bluff land, included in the original 1883 reservation deed but never formally developed, was being released from federal ownership. Falk had offered my father the opportunity to purchase that land under a provision that had existed since 1946. A little-known program that allowed long-serving keepers at remote stations to purchase adjacent parcels at agricultural land value. The provision was obscure. Falk had nearly forgotten it existed himself. He had looked it up because he liked my father and because the alternative was the land passing into county ownership, where it would likely be sold to a developer within a decade. My father had paid $420, a check from his savings account at the Aldwych Bank. Falk provided a properly executed federal land patent, notarized, with the parcel described in full, the southwest portion of the Harroway Point Federal Lighthouse Reservation, being 38 acres more or less, bounded on the west by the Pacific Ocean, on the north by the original reservation boundary, on the south by the county road right-of-way, on the east by the surveyed reservation line. The patent had been prepared by the Regional Coast Guard Office and signed by Harrison M. Falk under his authority as Regional Lands Administrator. It was dated March 14, 1969. My father had never recorded it with the county. He explained that in the letter, he had been afraid. Falk's authority to issue the patent was real, but the program was obscure enough that he worried any formal recording would trigger scrutiny, and scrutiny might trigger a federal challenge. And a federal challenge might mean losing both the land and the $420. He told himself he would wait. He would consult an attorney when he had more money. He told himself there would be time. There was not time. He had hidden the patent. When the decommissioning came in 1991 and he had to vacate the station, he did something he told no one. He sourced a piece of 1/4-inch steel plate from the machine shop in Aldwych and went to the lighthouse at night, 2 nights before he turned in his keys. He had cut the plate to fit a space in the concrete housing just below the lantern room floor, an alcove about 8 inches deep and 18 inches wide that had been part of the original construction, used by the keepers to store the clockwork winding tools. The alcove had been empty for years. He fitted the steel plate over it, welded it at the corners with a portable unit he borrowed from a friend, and painted over the weld seams with the same white paint used on the Lighthouse interior. Behind that plate, in a metal document tube sealed with wax, were the land patent, the canceled check for $420, the correspondence between him and Falk, and a typed legal summary of the provision under which the transaction had taken place. He had welded his most important document into the wall of a lighthouse he then walked out of and never came back to. He told me where to find it. Exactly which wall of the lantern room housing. The height from the floor. He described the painted-over seams as a rectangle roughly 16 by 20 inches, with a slight concavity at the upper right corner where the concrete had a natural recess. He ended the letter with one sentence that I have since read more times than I can count. He wrote, "I should have told you sooner. I should have told you many things sooner. But the land is real and it is yours, and I believed you were the one who would know what to do with it." I still believe that. I sat at my kitchen table until 2 in the morning. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The next morning, I drove to the hardware store in Aldwych and bought an oscillating multi-tool, a set of cutting blades, a pry bar, and a flashlight. The man at the counter asked what I was working on. "Old masonry," I said. "A sealed alcove." He nodded and didn't ask anything else. The road to the point was quiet that morning. A gray sky, no wind yet, the sea lions audible before I could see the water. I parked and sat for a moment with the letter in my hand, reading the relevant paragraph one more time. East wall of the lantern room housing, below the lantern room floor, approximately 4 feet above the landing. 16 by 20 inches. The upper right corner has a natural recess in the concrete. I took the equipment from the car and went inside. The climb to the lantern room landing took longer than the first visit. I was carrying tools, and I stopped on the landing to read the description one more time before I touched anything. The east wall of the housing was concrete, painted white, the same indefinite shade as everything else. I ran my hand along the surface at the height my father described. 30 years of paint had been applied in successive coats, and the surface had a slight plasticity under pressure, a softness that comes from accumulated layers. At approximately 4 feet from the landing floor, my fingers found it. The seam was nearly invisible. Multiple coats of paint had bridged it almost completely, but the straight edge of a metal plate beneath the surface made a line that my fingers could feel even when my eyes couldn't quite see it. I moved my hand slowly along the perimeter. 16 inches across, about 20 inches tall. At the upper right corner, where my father had mentioned the natural recess in the concrete, I felt the slight inward curve. I set down the pry bar and picked up the multi-tool. The oscillating blade cut through the paint film cleanly, the sound bouncing around the concrete housing in a thin, persistent ring. I worked slowly, following the seam my fingers had mapped, cutting through the layers that had bridged the plate to the surrounding wall over 3 decades of successive coats. The seam opened as the paint cracked away. The plate was clearly defined once the paint film was cut. 1/4-inch steel, exactly as the letter described. The weld seams at the 4 corners had been painted over with particular care. The person who did this work had been neat about it. I knew who had done this work. I switched to the pry bar. The plate had been welded, not bonded with adhesive, which meant the weld beads at the corners were the only attachment points. I worked the flat end of the bar into the gap at the bottom edge where the paint cut had left a small opening. I applied pressure slowly, evenly. The first corner weld broke with a single sharp crack that rang off the concrete walls and then dissolved into silence. I stopped and waited. I worked the bar to the second corner. The plate began to pull forward, separating from the wall in a long, grinding release of pressure held for 30 years. Dust fell from the edges of the opening. Cold air moved past my face from the space behind, the specific cold of a sealed place, air that had been sitting in the dark since 1991. The plate came free, heavier than it looked. I set it down on the landing floor and turned back to the opening. The alcove was exactly as described. 8 inches deep, 18 wide. Set against the back wall was a document tube. Aluminum, with a screw cap at one end. The cap had been sealed with red wax. I reached in and took it out. The tube was cold in my hands. Lighter than I expected. I sat down on the landing floor with my back against the opposite wall, the tube in my lap, the morning light coming in through the small east-facing window, and I held it for a moment before I opened it. 30 years. My father had climbed these stairs in the dark, 2 nights before turning in his keys, and welded this closed and walked away. He had carried this knowledge for 20 more years. Through retirement, through the strokes that took his speech and eventually his life, he had believed that the right person would find the letter in the right logbook and come to this coast and open this wall. He had believed it would be me. I turned the cap until the wax seal cracked and the tube opened. Inside, rolled carefully and wrapped in a sleeve of oilcloth, were the documents. I unrolled them on the landing floor. The oilcloth had done its job. The paper was dry, slightly yellowed at the edges, but intact. No mold, no brittleness, no water damage. The land patent was on top. 2 pages, government format, on paper with a faint federal watermark. At the top, the letterhead of the United States Coast Guard, 13th District. Below it, the formal language of a federal land conveyance. Know ye that by the authority vested in this office and pursuant to the provisions of the Keepers Adjacent Land Act of 1946, as amended, the following described parcel is hereby conveyed in fee simple to Edmund Weld, his heirs, and assigns forever. The legal description ran for half a page. Southwest portion of the Harroway Point Federal Lighthouse Reservation, State of Oregon, being 38 acres more or less, described as follows. Beginning at the southwest corner of the original reservation boundary at a point on the mean high water line of the Pacific Ocean, thence north along the surveyed reservation line. It continued with bearings and distances, the precise grammar of a land survey, naming monuments and reference points. I read every line. At the bottom of the second page, 2 signatures. On the left, Harrison M. Falk, Regional Lands Administrator, 13th Coast Guard District. On the right, my father's signature, Edmund Weld, in the firm hand I recognized from the early logbooks. Below both signatures, a notary seal. The notary's name was Patricia A. Cole. The commission number was stamped in blue ink. The date was March 14, 1969. Below the signatures, a receipt stamp. Received by Regional Administrator's Office, 13th District. Date, March 17, 1969. I turned to the second document. A letter from Harrison Falk to my father, dated March 6, 1969, 8 days before the patent. Formal in tone, but warm in its way. Falk confirmed the transaction, described the parcel, noted the applicable provision. He wrote, Keeper Weld, this parcel is yours by right of purchase and by right of service to this station. I would encourage you to record the instrument with Crestfall County at your earliest convenience. My father had not recorded it at his earliest convenience. He had not recorded it in 50 years. Behind Falk's letter, the canceled check. $420, drawn on the Aldwych Savings Bank, account of Edmund Weld, payable to the U.S. Coast Guard 13th District Land Account. Stamped paid across the face. And behind the check, a 4-page typed document titled, Legal Summary and Supporting Authority for Federal Land Patent Pursuant to the Keepers Adjacent Land Act of 1946. It laid out the applicable statute, the provisions requirements, the chain of authority that allowed Falk to issue the patent, and the specific way in which all those requirements had been met in this transaction. He had known what he had. He had done the research. He had been careful, the same way he was careful about everything. He had simply been afraid to record it. I sat on the landing floor of that lighthouse and looked at the documents spread across the concrete. 38 acres of Oregon coastal bluff land, purchased in 1969 for $420, federally conveyed, notarized, witnessed, documented in full. A patent that had been sitting behind a welded steel plate for 30 years while coastal property values moved into territory nobody, in 1969, would have imagined possible. While my father grew old and retired and died without telling anyone he owned it. Except me. Eventually. Through a logbook and a taped envelope and a trust that I would not recycle the notebooks. I drove back to Aldwych with the document tube on the passenger seat, my jacket folded beneath it, the way you carry something you don't want to slide around. I called a property attorney that evening. My father's former lawyer had retired and referred me to a firm in town. The attorney I reached was named Clara Osgood, and she was practical on the phone in a way I appreciated immediately. I described what I had found without embellishment. A federal land patent from 1969. 38 acres. Unrecorded. She was quiet for a moment. Bring it in tomorrow morning, she said. Bring everything. The patent, the supporting documents, the check, the correspondence. Don't make copies yet. Bring the originals. I was at her office at 8:30. Clara Osgood was 60. With reading glasses, she pushed up onto her head when she was thinking and back down onto her nose when she was looking at something specific. She read the patent slowly, turned each page, read it again. She went through the Falk letter. She examined the canceled check. She read the legal summary twice. Then she took her glasses off and set them on the desk. This is a federal land patent, she said. Properly executed, notarized, signed by an authorized regional administrator. Yes, I said. Never recorded. No, which means it never entered the public record. The county has had no notice of private ownership for 55 years. The tax rolls would show the land as part of the original federal reservation transferred to county jurisdiction at decommissioning. She paused. You understand what that means. The county thinks the land is theirs, I said, or federal remnant land. They sold you a half-acre parcel this week. They would have no idea there's an adjacent 38-acre parcel with a separate chain of title. She picked up the legal summary document. Can I ask who prepared this? My father, I said, or someone he hired. She looked at me over her glasses. Then she nodded, the way people do when a piece of information settles something they'd been holding open. The recording issue is real, she said. Recording provides constructive notice. Without it, third parties dealing with the land in good faith might argue they had no notice of private ownership. But, she set the document down. A federal land patent is among the strongest instruments in property law. It is a direct conveyance from the federal government to a named individual. Courts have historically been very reluctant to invalidate them. A prior valid title generally prevails. What do I do? I said. She told me clearly and in order. First, the patent needed examination by a title firm with expertise in federal land patents, a specific area. She knew a firm in Portland. Second, I needed a current survey to confirm the patent's legal description against modern land records. Third, the patent needed to be recorded with Crestfall County once the title review was complete. Fourth, I was not to discuss any of this with the county or with anyone else until that review was done. Anyone, she said. My brother and sister, I said. Anyone, she repeated. I understood what she was not saying. The window between my walking out of that lighthouse with the documents and their being formally recorded was a window in which things could become complicated. Powerful because the underlying instrument was sound. Fragile because it was still unrecorded. I drove home. I did not call Kevin. I did not call Pamela. The title firm Clara recommended was Arroyo and Stell in Portland. The attorney there who handled federal land patents was named Marcus Webb. He was 55 and had spent 20 years on Western land title cases involving railroad grants, homestead entries, and government conveyances. Clara described him as the person you call when you have something unusual. He agreed to see me on Friday. I drove to Portland Thursday night and slept in a motel near the interstate. Friday morning, I laid the documents out on his conference table and watched him read. He read for 45 minutes without speaking. When he finished, he looked at the ceiling briefly. Then he looked at me. The Keepers Adjacent Land Act of 1946, he said. In 20 years I've seen 3 of these, maybe 4. The program was terminated in 1972 when Congress revised the federal lighthouse management statutes. Any patents issued before 1972 under the program are still valid. This is from 1969, I said. Yes. He looked at the patent again. Harrison Falk. I've come across his name in other contexts. He was a careful administrator. The regional office under him had a reputation for thorough documentation. He tapped the notary seal. The notarization is good. The commission number checks out against Oregon state records from that period. The 38 acres, I said. That's what the survey will confirm. The bearings in the legal description are from 1969. We need to know what they correspond to on the current cadastral survey. But the general location matches what you've described. He folded his hands on the table. Ms. Weld, if this survey confirms the description, You are holding a valid title to 38 acres of Oregon coastal bluff land. What is that worth? I said. He chose his words the way attorneys do when someone asks a question outside their lane. I can't appraise land, but I can tell you that coastal bluff property in Crestfall County, at current market conditions, depending on access and site characteristics, tends to trade at values that would be significant. He said he would begin the title review immediately. He had a surveying firm he worked with regularly. The survey could be completed within 10 days, the title review within 3 weeks. I drove back to Aldwick in the dark. The surveyor was a woman named Diane Pruitt, and she came to the point 2 days later with her equipment and her assistant and spent most of a day establishing the current boundaries of the parcel described in the 1969 patent. She told me nothing until she had all her measurements. She called me 5 days later. The parcel was 37.4 acres, slightly smaller than described due to coastal erosion along the western boundary over 55 years. The boundary on the north, south, and east matched the patent's description with adjustments for modern cadastral reference points. The parcel was contiguous with the half-acre Lighthouse lot. It's a clean boundary, she said. No encroachments from adjacent properties. The county road right-of-way sits on the south side exactly as described. The western boundary follows the current mean high water line. Marcus Webb called me when the title review was complete. I was at my kitchen table when the phone rang, the same table where I had read my father's letter. The title is clean, he said. The chain runs from the 1883 original federal reservation deed through the 1969 patent to your father and by descent to you as his sole heir. No competing claims, no recorded liens, no prior conveyances of this parcel to any other party. The county's ownership of the Lighthouse half-acre is separate and creates no conflict. A brief pause. I'm recommending we record the patent with Crestfall County immediately. Do it, I said. The recording took place on a Tuesday morning. Marcus Webb filed with Crestfall County. The deputy clerk stamped the instrument and returned the copy. The patent entered the public record at 10:47 in the morning on a Tuesday in December, 55 years after it was signed, 11 years after my father died. I was in a grocery store parking lot in Aldwick when Marcus Webb sent me the scan of the stamped copy. I sat in the car and looked at the county recording stamp on my phone screen for a long time. Clara Osgood referred me to a land appraiser named Ted Moreau, who had 30 years of experience with coastal properties in Oregon. He came to the point on a weekday, walked the land in his waterproof boots, photographed everything, made notes in a spiral pad, and left without saying much. His written appraisal arrived 2 weeks later. He had assessed the 37.4 acres as raw land, undeveloped coastal bluff with existing terrain features, ocean views, contiguous access from the county road. He noted the absence of development restrictions beyond standard coastal zone regulations, which limited certain construction types, but did not prohibit residential or commercial development under proper permitting. His appraised value was a number I read twice. Not a lottery figure. Not the kind of number that makes ordinary decisions irrelevant. The kind of number that changes the pressure of things without changing their shape entirely. The kind of money that means the next several years can be faced from a position of steadiness rather than anxiety. Enough that the question of what to do next could be asked on her own terms. The appraised value for the combined 37.9 acres, including the Lighthouse half-acre, was $740,000. At the conservative end, Moreau noted that recent comparable coastal sales in the county had run above his base estimate and that the figure should be considered a floor. My father had paid $420 for the land. I had paid $7 more for the Lighthouse. Clara Osgood called me the morning after the appraisal arrived. That's the low end, she said. I know. You have options, she said. You can sell outright. You can develop under the coastal zone provisions. You can hold. You can arrange a conservation easement with one of the land trusts that operates in the county. You have time to think. The news traveled the way news travels in a county where everyone has known everyone's family for decades. Not all at once, but in pieces, through channels that are neither entirely formal nor entirely informal. By 3 weeks after the recording date, the people in Aldwick who paid attention to property matters knew that the lighthouse at Harroway Point had an adjacent 38-acre private title that had been hiding in a gap in the public record since 1969, and that it belonged to the daughter of the last keeper. Pamela called me on a Thursday evening. She had heard through a woman she knew at the county planning office. Is it true? She said. No preamble. Yes, I said. The coastal land. It's yours. It was Dad's. He bought it in 1969. He just never recorded the deed. A pause. He never told us, she said. He told me. I said. Eventually. I heard her processing that. In the logbooks, she said. She had known I kept them. Yes. And you found it. Yes. The pause that followed had a different quality than the ones before it. Less like the sound of someone calculating and more like the sound of someone who has understood something about a situation they thought they already understood. I laughed, she said. At the auction. I know, I said. I told Kevin you were making bad decisions. She was not a person who apologized easily. She had a stubborn streak that matched mine, inherited from the same source. But she said, quietly and without elaboration, I was wrong about the lighthouse. I was wrong about all of it. You couldn't have known, I said. No, she said. But I should have asked instead of laughing. Kevin called the following week. His call was more measured. Kevin was an accountant, and he processed things at his own pace. He said he was glad for me. He said he hoped I would make good decisions about the land, which was his way of expressing concern without quite expressing it. He said he had been thinking about the logbooks. Should I have kept them too? He said. There was nothing in yours to find. He put the letter in the last volume. You took one of the early ones. He knew you'd read them all, Kevin said. He did, I said. Kevin was quiet for a moment. He was a smart man, he said. Not competitively. Not as an observation designed to land anywhere in particular. Just the plain truth of it. He was, I said. I called Roy Finn at the county administration office. Not to make a point. He deserved to know, having processed the sale and looked at me in the way he had. I explained briefly what had been in the lighthouse. He was quiet on the phone. A federal land patent, he said. From 1969. My father purchased the adjacent acreage from the Coast Guard under a keeper's provision. Another moment of quiet. In 19 years of county property work, he said, I have never seen anything like that. The title attorney in Portland said he'd seen 3 in 20 years, I said. The county had no record of any prior private claim on that parcel, he said. It was listed as decommissioned federal land. I know. That's why nobody bid on the lighthouse. A pause. Then a short, honest sound of recognition, not quite a laugh, but something adjacent to it. $7, he said. $7, I said. I didn't sell the land. Not right away, and maybe not for a while. The first thing I did was pay off the debt I had accumulated during the months of unemployment. The second was to have a long conversation with Clara Osgood and Marcus Webb about what a thoughtful approach to the property would look like. Marcus Webb had a contact at the Oregon Coast Conservancy, a nonprofit working with private landowners on conservation easements. An easement would allow me to retain ownership while permanently restricting development above certain thresholds, protecting the bluff ecosystem, and providing a substantial payment in exchange for those restrictions. The coastal bluff at Harroway Point included nesting habitat that the Conservancy had identified as significant. They were interested. The easement closed in April. The payment it generated was not a fortune. It was the kind of money that changes the pressure of things without changing the shape of them. I paid off the remainder of my debts. I put the rest in an account I did not spend from immediately. I had time. I drove to the point on a morning in February to walk the land and think about the offer. The grass on the bluff was short and brown, beaten down by winter. The ocean below was gray-green, moving hard against the rocks. The lighthouse stood at the end of the point, white against a pale sky. I walked the full perimeter, 37.4 acres. I walked it slowly, the way you walk something that belongs to you when you want to understand what that means. My father had walked this same perimeter. After the keeper's position ended and he was living in rented rooms in Aldwick, he had still driven to the point sometimes. A neighbor near the road had mentioned it to me once, years ago. She used to see an old man park at the turnoff and walk up toward the lighthouse in the early mornings. She hadn't known who he was. He came back to it, even without being able to say why openly, even with the whole thing sealed behind a welded plate in a wall. Near the end of his letter, after the practical information and the explanation and the apology for keeping it so long, my father had written a single short paragraph that I kept returning to. He wrote, I bought that land because I wanted there to be something solid that I could leave, not because I had any clear plan for what it would become. I just understood that the ocean was not going to stop being the ocean, and that the point was not going to go anywhere, and that if I could attach your name to something real and permanent and impossible to argue out from under you, that was worth more than whatever it cost me to do it. I should have been less afraid of what I had. But I hope you understand that I was doing the best I could with what I knew how to do. He was doing the best he could with what he knew how to do. I have thought about that sentence many times since reading it. The honesty in it. The acknowledgement that secrecy and patience are not always the same thing. That a fear held too long becomes its own kind of loss. He had known that. He named it clearly. But he had also known the land was real and documented and would hold. That it had held. That it had waited. I stopped at the western edge of the bluff and looked out at the water. Behind me was the lighthouse my father had kept for 24 years. Beside it was the cottage where I had done homework by lamplight. Below me were the rocks where the sea lions argued in their ongoing way. The land under my feet was mine by right of a $46.20 discrepancy between what my father had known and what the rest of the world had assumed. It was mine because he had known me clearly enough to trust the right piece of information to the right place and believe I would find it. I turned and walked back to the lighthouse. The lighthouse itself I am in the process of restoring. Not to habitability, to something closer to its original condition. The cottage roof has been repaired. The iron stairs in the tower have been treated for corrosion. A contractor in Aldwick who has worked on historic structures is handling the exterior. The Fresnel lens in the lantern room is being cleaned. Not for use. It will never be a working light again. But the prisms are intact, and the brass fittings can be polished, and the old light deserves better than another 30 years of accumulated dust. The logbooks are on a shelf in the cottage now, the 26 volumes in order, the first dated 1967 and the last dated 1991. The letter that was taped inside the back cover of the last volume I have framed. It hangs on the wall of the cottage above the shelf. Roy Finn stopped by the point one Saturday when I was there working. He came around the corner of the cottage, looked at the restoration in progress, looked at the lighthouse, and nodded once. "Coming along," he said. "Slowly," I said. He looked at the tower for a moment. "Your father kept a good light," he said. Not in a sentimental way, just as a statement of fact, the way people state facts when the facts carry their own weight. "He did," I said. Roy Finn nodded again and walked back to his truck. I stayed until the sun went down. The ocean went gray and then dark and the stars came out over the water, thick and clear the way they are when you are far from the lights of town. The lighthouse stood at the end of the point. No light in the lantern room. No foghorn. Just the structure, the way it had been for 140 years, the way it would be for however long the point held. My father had kept this place. He had bought the land around it and sealed the proof in its walls and trusted the right person to find it. The land was recorded now. The lighthouse was mine. The steel plate he had welded into that wall was leaning against the cottage in the sun, and I was still deciding what to do with it. I thought I might keep it. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.